If you're interested in an inventive biography of one of the world's greatest artists, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'll be reviewing The Agony and the Ecstasy by Irving Stone. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we will be discussing a biography that is also a novel that is of questionable value to me as a historian, but I certainly enjoyed it. That is, of course, The Agony and the Ecstasy. This was a novel that came out in 1961. It is by Irving Stone, who is known for writing both biographies, but also these biographical novels where he has to take a lot of liberties in telling the story that he wants to tell. This is, at its face value, an attempted biography at Michelangelo, and it covers the majority of his life. I actually just did another video that was a little biography of Michelangelo as well, that was essentially trying to give some actual background information about this famous artist that might have been obscured in a book like this, where the author is taking significant liberties to tell the story the way that he wants to. I read these books together, wanting to know how much could I appreciate this book, The Agony and the Ecstasy? Like, what elements should I be able to take from it, and what elements did I feel like he was clearly inventing? The most common thing that he is going to invent in a book like this is the dialogue. That is certainly the thing that he simply has to make up. He does have a fair amount of letters and some poetry that he can incorporate that does give some idea of what exactly Michelangelo would have sounded like, although of course that is going through centuries and translations, so that would require, again, some creativity in making it readable by a modern audience, especially since the rest of the book, including the dialogue, is going to reflect a modern English speaker. Let me address the title of the book, because I think that gets at the heart of the character of Michelangelo that he is trying to present, and I will say that that is probably the thing that I found most authentic about this book. So most of the details that he shares in terms of where Michelangelo lived, who his patrons would have been, the types of people that he would have interacted with, his approaches to doing art, the ways that he would have been revolutionary, all of that I'm pretty sure was pretty accurate. Maybe not down to every detail, but certainly he had a lot of the broad strokes correct. This idea of getting into his personality, the agony and the ecstasy, that one is a little more challenging, but I would say that that is certainly something that he works hard to present, and it certainly comes through. You are, by the end of this book, you are well aware of the fact that Michelangelo was very much an incredibly capable and talented individual, but he was also someone that was frequently plagued by his own strengths and also his own understanding of his strengths. He didn't consider himself a great painter, yet he is responsible for some of the greatest paintings in history. He really considered himself a sculptor, but this was at a time when being a sculptor just was not it was not prestigious enough, and so that was a challenge that he faced, especially with his father, in wanting to pursue this avenue that no one thought would make him a whole lot of money. But along the way, he is actually going to completely redefine what sculptures could be like. And so that is going to be one of the things that is plaguing him his whole life. And that is the type of thing that I actually do think that this book captures well. Now, that being said, even the anecdotes I did have to be wary about. Like I said, almost all the dialogue is going to be completely invented, but the anecdotes of his interaction with individuals, or suggesting maybe when he would have first learned something. There's one period in there where he talks about going into the morgue to observe and even dissect some bodies. And I know that that was a part of what Michelangelo did to be able to better depict the human form, but I don't know if that presentation of it was quite accurate. And I'm sure I could go find out more, but again, this is one of those things where I have to balance what he has presented to me about an individual with the need to actually do all this additional research. And that's not something I always love as a historian, but I will say that I did, after reading this and the other short but more reliable biography, I do think this presentation and this perception of him as a tortured artist who is dealing with both the incredible euphoria that comes from successfully creating art, especially art that connects with this divine nature, as well as the agony that comes with actually trying to create something, make something that is successful, always self-doubting yourself, and the additional politics and the questions of patronage and keeping everyone happy, as well as his own family. Like I said, his father didn't think this was a viable avenue to pursue. All of that seems to have been pretty well embodied in this book. I should say that this book, in addition to being probably Stone's most well-known book, it then had a Hollywood movie made of it that I think made it all the more well-known. And I believe this one also may have won just some of the big awards at the time. I'm not entirely sure. But the point is that despite being more than 60 years old at this point. It has had a long life in pop culture, and it has been a well-regarded and a well-remembered book that I think a lot of people, especially growing up in the 80s and 90s, were familiar with this book and the idea of trying to capture the essence of an artist, even a Renaissance artist that lived 500 years ago. I think that approach really shaped and helped people to see themselves in the lives and to try and better understand him as an artist. But as always, you do have to be balancing that with what is well-regarded historical fact, documentation, and then what are the liberties that are being taken to get that across. One of the strengths of this book, in addition to trying to really capture the entirety of the life and the personality, I would say that's probably one of the biggest things it's trying to do is really help you understand the personality of Michelangelo. And I will say that one of the things that really benefited in his writing is that it was well researched. Right before he wrote this, one of the things that really benefited his research was a publication of nearly 500 letters that Michelangelo wrote. And so that gave him a good deal of primary sources to work with in a way that is pretty unique. As a historian of not this time period, but slightly before this, I can tell you that we can be really hard pressed in finding sources for some major events. And of course, Michelangelo was very famous in his time, but many people probably considered his works to speak enough for the quality of this individual. But I would say we actually have the great benefit of all those letters, and that is something that is quite distinct from that time period, and something that really gives us an opportunity to dive deep in, and something that also really benefited Irving Stone in his writing about Michelangelo. So who is this for? Well, it is going to be for someone that can understand from the get-go. Well, first of all, it's really long. So it's going to be for someone that can handle just how long this book is. I had a friend suggest this last year. I try to get through suggestions quicker than this, but I just had to keep getting put on the back burner just because of how long it was. And it is also for anyone that understand that there are only certain things that you can take from this book. And even those things are still up to the author's interpretation. I think that Irving Stone's purpose in presenting Michelangelo in this kind of tortured artist way, I think that there was value in that. And I think it's probably a fair interpretation of it based off of the other biography about him that I read. But even that is subject to additional scrutiny. And I certainly think that even if that was the big thing that you took away from this book, there is still room for an additional discussion. I think that the primary sources that you can readily recognize, so if it's coming straight from a letter, if it's coming from some of his poetry, any of that, that is going to be very helpful in bolstering the main argument that he's making. And then I think almost any dialogue that happens, you can probably just disregard that. That's probably not a verifiable dialogue, which does mean that even those interactions, regardless of whether we have the dialogue or not, those are probably going to be the hardest things to reconcile with how much actual history you're learning. But not everyone is like me. Not everyone's obsessed with being able to get down to, in historical representation, what actually happened, what is documented, and what is some artistic license being taken. And I understand that. So if that is not an issue for you, then this book is certainly for you, if you can get through just how long it is. It is long, but I enjoyed it. I didn't know I enjoyed biography so much. This last year I read many more of them than I think I ever had, and I by and large found them to be very impressive, and I thought this was a good one, even though this one is not entirely a biography, or at least not as wholly reliable as a traditional biography. Who is this not for? Well, it's long. Or if you're not particularly interested in Michelangelo, or like me as a historian, you don't really want to put the extra time into balancing what the value of this is, knowing that you need to do additional research to verify any of the anecdotes or any of the dialogue that he shares. So it's not going to be for probably most people, but I'm confident, especially since this has been a well-known novel throughout the decades, that there are people that this is useful for. And I will say that I certainly enjoyed the read, and it was useful to me to an extent. It will just always be a balancing act of how much actual history did I learn, and then how much history was being, invented and toyed with and tinkered with. And that is something that I've always had to acknowledge and engage with in a world that has always played fast and loose with telling history. I would love to know your thoughts on this book. Please let me know in the comments what you thought about not just this book, but this approach to telling history, whether you find it beneficial to you, or if, like me, you think that it can be beneficial, but it just takes a little bit more work. Please let me know in the comments, but don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.